So, have you ever thought about what happens when you flush a toilet, or when you take a shower, or when you dump something down a drain? For me, this kind of thing is like magic. I mean, wastewater that we produce is gone, it's taken care of, and then we have fresh water available when we need it. And it's a very much a out of sight, out of mind kind of process, but it's really a very significant issue in public health and the difference between a developed country and a developing country. And that's something that I think we really also take for granted a lot of times living in a place like the United States, is that we can just turn on a faucet, we can go up to a drinking fountain, and we have a water source that isn't laced with, intestinal pathogens or something that's going to make us sick. And like I was saying before, I mean, in the majority of the world, that's really not true. Like, I know when I lived in Ecuador, you couldn't drink the tap water, or at least you weren't supposed to. I had some friends that tested that theory. But this is going to be a discussion about water treatment, and specifically how that process works, why it's important. And I used to think of water treatment, wastewater treatment, as something that necessarily had to be a very synthetic kind of process. You need lots of chemicals, lots of high-tech filters. But in reality, it relies primarily on microbes to do most of the heavy lifting. So we're going to look at water treatment as a process and specifically give some emphasis onto the role that microbes play in water treatment. So first of all, and this is maybe an obvious kind of question, but why is it that we actually have to treat wastewater? So wastewater is usually dumped into natural bodies of water like lakes or rivers or streams, and before it's released into those natural bodies of water, it has to be treated, and that's what happens at a wastewater treatment facility. And one of the main things that I think people associate with untreated wastewater, with sewage, is the bacteria and the microorganisms that are in it that can potentially make you sick. So some of these look fairly familiar. Okay, we have E. coli, things like Salmonella and Shigella, Vibrio cholerae. And then we also have some non-bacterial microbes, protozoans like Giardia, which most people have probably heard of, worms, and then different types of viruses. Okay, maybe if you've ever gone to a country in South America or Africa, you've needed to get a hepatitis A vaccination. These are all different types of microbes that can be present in untreated sewage and untreated wastewater, and when they come in contact with our drinking water supplies, or when they contaminate natural bodies of water from which our drinking water supply is drawn, they can cause a lot of different types of diseases. And that's probably the most straightforward reason as to why we have to treat domestic wastewater, why we have to treat sewage before it just gets released into the environment. So that probably goes without saying. The types of facilities at which wastewater is treated look something like this. So this is a large wastewater treatment plant in Milwaukee. And we're going to come back to this image a little bit later on, and we're going to walk through each part of the plant, and I'm going to tell you like what each part does and what all of these different tanks actually are, okay? Because it's an interesting process. So we're going to begin by talking about where wastewater actually comes from. And I'm going to distinguish between two different types of wastewater. And one is what we're going to call the black water. And this is like toilet water, okay? This is sewage. And the other type of water that we're going to talk about is the gray water. And gray water is not sewage. I've heard it called sullage before, which sort of sounds like sewage. But this is the type of water that comes from our sinks, that comes from our showers, so it's not toilet water. And then the third type of water that we're going to talk about is stormwater, okay? And this is surface water that is collected as runoff after rain. Okay, and traditionally all three of these types of waters would be treated at a single facility, a single wastewater treatment plant. There's actually a trend in some very large cities that I was reading about to design separate plants to treat, so they have one type of plant that treats the black and the gray water, and then they have a separate type of plant that's used to treat the storm water. And that's to reduce costs in the long run. Obviously, initially it's more expensive because you have to build multiple plants. But for the purposes of this talk, we're just going to consider wastewater treatment plants that are designed to treat all of these different types of water. So I've always had kind of a fascination with manhole covers because it seems like it's like a portal into another underground world or dimension or something. So if you lift up a manhole cover, specifically one that says sewer, like this one, it looks something like this. So these are the walls here of the manhole, and you can see the little steps that are coated in some lovely brown sludge there. And there's two interesting things going on here. So we see the sewer main, which is the main sewer pipeline, and then we have another sewer line that maybe is coming from a house or a business or maybe several different houses, and it's joining the sewer main here to form this T-junction. So this water in here is the black water and the gray water that's combined. So it's water that comes from toilets, that comes from bathtubs and showers, from things that you pour down the drain. So this is kind of like the Seinfeld episode, right, or the joke where Elaine gets mad at George because he pees in the shower, and different pipes go to different places. George is actually right. Okay, the gray water, the water that is comes from a shower drain, ultimately does go to the exact same place as water that comes from a toilet. So if that's your only concern about peeing in the shower, you can probably do that with impunity, because the water does end up ultimately going to the same place. So that's the black water and the gray water sanitary sewers. And then the third type of water that I talked about, the storm water, is collected in storm drains like this that we're all very familiar with. So when it rains, right, we have surface water or runoff that falls into a storm drain and then goes into either a separate sewer or a combined sewer. Okay, and obviously these are necessary because if the water was just allowed to sit on the surface and it had nowhere to go, then that would cause flooding. So this is what a storm sewer looks like on the inside. So it's just sort of a big concrete tube. And there's two different types of sewers. You have separate sewers for stormwater, like what we see here. Okay, this is a stormwater sewer, and then we looked at a sanitary sewer. Some cities, though, will have combined sewers, which are designed to handle all types of water, the black water and the gray water, and then also the storm water. And that can be potentially problematic, okay, for a reason that I'm going to explain right now. So here we're looking at a situation where we have a combined sewer that collects wastewater from some sort of a business or a residential building, and then we also have a storm sewer, okay, that is combined with that sewer to form the combined sewer. And ideally, it just flows down through the sewer to the water treatment plant. The POW is the publicly owned treatment works. What's problematic about the combined sewer is that if we have a lot of rain, that means there's a lot of water entering through the storm drains. And one thing that I think isn't maybe clear to a lot of people is that water treatment plants have capacities. If that capacity is exceeded, that means that water has to go somewhere else and it's not going to be treated. So there's two options in that case. So here we see a lot of rain, okay, and the combined sewer is flooded and the plant is at capacity. So what can either happen is the water can essentially backlog and flow out through the storm drain, or you have your sewage water backing up into your house or your business, which obviously is pretty disgusting. Or there's some sort of an outlet that's been designed so that the wastewater, the raw sewage, just gets dumped into some sort of a natural body of water. Obviously, sewer discharge into a river or a lake isn't really a great option either. And that's why there's definitely a trend in a lot of larger cities to create separate storm sewers and sanitary sewers, so that after rain, there's a dedicated storm sewer to handle that amount of water, okay, and maybe even a dedicated water treatment plant to handle that much water, so that you don't risk having a backup that then leads to sewage getting dumped into a natural body of water or backflowing into a house or out of a storm drain. So you can get a sense of why water treatment isn't something that's readily available in a lot of developing countries. There's an extensive infrastructure that has to be in place just to get the water to the water treatment plant. We haven't even talked about what happens at the plant yet. So it's expensive, right? And this is why a lot of countries don't have drinkable water on tap and why they don't have the best sanitary water conditions. So here's an instance of, what happens when that combined sewer overflows, right, is that we just get that raw wastewater that's just getting released directly into the environment. Another thing that I should mention is that how the wastewater actually gets to the water treatment plant is just through gravity. So these pipes are designed, the sewer is designed so that it gets deeper and deeper so that the water just naturally flows to the treatment facility. Obviously, at some point, those sewer pipes are going to become too deep to be practical to make them even deeper, and that's when electrical pumps have to be used. And once again, it's important for those pumps to be constantly functioning, right? So that requires a lot of electricity and a lot of different backup systems to make sure that those pumps don't fail, which could lead to a pretty disgusting situation in a lot of people's homes. So let's actually start talking about what the actual wastewater treatment process looks like right now. And the Westner text on which I'm basing this lecture cites three different goals of wastewater treatment. And the first goal is to reduce the total amount of organic carbon that's within the water. Then we want to destroy or at least disable the diversity of different types of pathogens or pathogenic microorganisms that are in the water, in the wastewater. And then finally, we want to reduce the amount of different types of inorganic compounds. These are a lot of times things that are ammonia-based or they're derived from different types of fertilizers, things like nitrates and phosphates that might be present in wastewater. And we'll talk about, when we go through the process of wastewater treatment in just a minute, how each one of these steps is addressed and why that actually matters, okay, in the long run in terms of wastewater treatment. The other thing I want to say is some chemicals, some industrial byproducts or pharmaceutical metabolites that are present in urine cannot effectively be treated by ordinary wastewater treatment methods, and those become what are called persistent organic pollutants. Persistent organic pollutants. And so here I have, right, everyone's favorite molecule, fluoxetine, right, which is the active ingredient in the antidepressant Prozac. And a lot of times I'll see these campaigns for preventing prescription drug abuse where they'll say, dump your unused prescription drugs down the toilet. It's not really a great idea because then you get these persistent organic pollutants, okay, products like these present in the water supply, and then that means that everyone's taking Prozac, essentially, right, when they have a sip of water. Large refineries or industrial plants that produce a lot of kind of unusual toxic byproducts, a lot of times will have their own water treatment facilities to remove hazardous materials, just because the public water treatment plant is not designed to handle water that contains some of these unusual products. So they'll treat their own water and then it gets additionally treated by the public water treatment plant. So we're ready to start talking about the actual water treatment process. So here's the water, right? So you can imagine this is maybe, I don't know, some sort of sewer entry point or something into a water treatment facility here. It's what's called pre-treatment. And we have this grate here, okay? It's a bar screen. So this one's made of metal. Sometimes they're made of mesh. But it's just iron bars or whatever, this metal bars that are located just couple of inches apart from one another. And the purpose of the screen is to collect any large pieces of solid matter. And I was reading about some of the bizarre things that water treatment plant workers have discovered trapped in these bar screens. Things like diapers, like socks, 2x4s, and a set of dentures or false teeth. So anything that gets dumped, flushed down a toilet or shoved in a storm sewer eventually will end up getting caught on this screen. And obviously we don't want these giant pieces of matter in our water supply, so that's one reason to collect them here at the bar screen. The main reason, though, is also that we don't, those types of large pieces of matter like that would damage the plant machinery. And some larger facilities, some larger water treatment facilities will also have special grit chambers that are specifically designed to remove little bits of gravel or glass that are present within the incoming water supply that could also damage the machinery. Smaller plants, which I would not want to have to do this job, but they actually have to have someone come out with like a scraper, and they have to scrape the screen to clean it off because this gets covered in a lot of crap and gunk, as you can imagine. Larger plants, and I chose this picture because this is an example here, have these like mechanical scraper type things here, so you can see like the gear and chain assembly here. And there's some sort of a scraper, I think it's right here. Here's the scraper. And the scraper will actually come down and go back and forth, and it'll actually clean off all the gunk on the screen so it doesn't get clogged up. So that's the pre-treatment, and now we're ready to enter into the primary treatment, and this is where the sedimentation occurs. I think these are like the big kind of iconic thing that I associate with water treatment plants, and these are the primary clarifiers. So once the water is passed through the bar screen, it's held in these large, usually circular tanks for a few hours to allow the oil and grease that's in the water to float to the top of the water, and then any of the particulate matter or sediment will settle out on the bottom of the tank, okay? So it partitions off from the rest of the clear water. And you can see this sort of catwalk bridge type thing coming out here. This one only goes halfway. But in the city where I grew up, the bridges here went all the way across, like that. And I used to think that it was just so you wouldn't have to walk all the way around the tank. You could just cross the bridge. But actually, this is designed so that you can pick up the oil or the sediment that's collected on the top or on the bottom of the primary clarifier. So here's one that's not filled with water. And you can see how the bottom, the sloped bottom here of the clarifier, and this is designed this way to collect the sediment so that it falls towards the center of the tank. And the bridge part, which is what we see here, is equipped with this skimmer, which picks up the oil and the greasy particles that have accumulated on the top of the water. And then we have these scrapers or these rakers, which move along the bottom of the primary clarification tank, and it picks up all of the sediment that's settled off. Okay, so this whole assembly will rotate like this. Okay, will move through the primary clarifier, rotating like this, and it'll pick up all the gunk that's accumulated on the bottom and on the top, on the surface of the water. And that all gets fed here into the middle. And this junk that gets collected constitutes what's called the primary sludge, because this is the primary treatment phase. And that sludge will get taken to do the anaerobic sludge digester, which is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. So once we've removed the primary sludge, we have the water is sort of allowed to drain out, right, and to accumulate along the periphery here of the primary clarifiers. At this point, it still contains a ton of microbes and a lot of different dissolved organic and inorganic materials. So we're ready to move on to the next stage, and this is secondary treatment. And this is really where microbes take the stage. This is the biological treatment portion. Now, there's many different methods of secondary treatment. I'm just going to focus on two. And these are the two that are described in the Westner text. The first one is the simpler method, and that's the trickling filter method, or what's the attached growth method. And what it consists of is a high surface area filter bed, or some sort of a matrix. So this one looks like it's made of some sort of synthetic polymer or some sort of material, but it could be carbon, it could be, I don't know, calcium carbonate, some sort of material. But these objects are coated with a very dense community of microbes. Microbes that are naturally occurring, that would be naturally present in water supplies, although in a much lower concentration. And the primary effluent, okay, which is coming out of the primary clarifiers, is sprayed out onto the matrix. Okay, here's a better picture of what that looks like. So here we see, maybe we've got some activated charcoal or something here, and the primary effluent gets sprayed out onto that high surface area matrix. And each one of these carbon chunks is covered with that dense community of microbes. And the particulate matter, the organic matter that's contained within the primary effluent, serves as a food source for the biofilms that are embedded as this matrix as the water passes through it. And a biofilm is like a community or an aggregation of different types of microbes. So here we have just a collection of microbes, and they aggregate and they form these complex communities. And the material, the organic matter that's contained within the water, feeds the biofilm, which allows it to grow. And then usually most water treatment facilities will use rotifers or nematode worms that will graze on the biofilm that keep it healthy, and they allow the bacteria in the biofilm communities to continually be replenished. So it's sort of like a self-cleaning filter in this sense. So the dissolved organic matter gets decomposed into inorganic matter. Okay, this process is called mineralization. And then that inorganic matter is absorbed and it's utilized by the biofilm microbes. So here we see a picture of whatever, I think it's actually the same thing that was in this original picture here, some sort of a synthetic object or polymer or something, and you can see the biofilm growing here on the inside of whatever this matrix is made of. And it's designed on purpose to have a large surface area so that the water that passes through this, all of the different organic material that's in the wastewater, can feed this biofilm. So over time, as this biofilm then it begins to accumulate the different types of organic and inorganic nutrients that are present in the wastewater, the concentration of those nutrients in the water begins to decrease. And that biofilm continues to grow And it can become problematic if this biofilm obviously gets too thick and it clogs the matrix, then the water it doesn't go anywhere, right? And then they have to be cleaned. So this thing, yeah, I don't think I can eat rotelli pasta anymore after seeing this picture, right? Because now I'm just going to always picture these as being covered in biofilms here on the inside. And I couldn't find a great picture, but each one of these little tiny discs here is one of these. So they're pretty small, okay? And the idea is that you would dump a bunch of them into your secondary treatment tank, okay? So that as the water passes through it, you'd have lots of little tiny biofilm filters the water has to pass through. So this is much more common, what we're going to talk about now. So as opposed to the trickling filter method, it's a relatively simple process, but it's not used at most larger facilities. They'll use a different type of secondary treatment method called the activated sludge method, or the suspended growth method. So the primary effluent then, as it leaves those big primary clarifiers, instead of going through the trickling filter matrix, will enter these huge aeration tanks, okay? And it remains here for like, I don't know, 5 or 10 hours probably at the most. And in this tank, the effluent is oxygenated. So there's actually air, you can see some of the piping here, air that gets pumped into this tank, and that's why it looks kind of like frothy or bubbly, because there's oxygen that's getting pumped in here. And this allows aerobic microbes to proliferate, and they form these globs of biofilm in particulate matter that are called flocs, okay? And that process is called flocculation. So the reason oxygen gets pumped into these activated sludge tanks is because aerobic metabolism is a significantly more efficient process than anaerobic metabolism, okay? And the types of microbes that are going to be doing most of the hard work here are obligate aerobes, or facultative anaerobes. I mentioned this process of flocculation, which is essentially just globs, tiny globs of bacteria and particulate matter, or different nutrients, okay? It's similar in concept to the biofilm. So here's what a floc looks like. There's small, dense particles that should only be about a millimeter or so at the absolute most across. And in some situations, like if the aeration tank gets just inundated with a ton of really nutrient-rich water, the conditions can become anaerobic because there's so much nutrients in there that the bacteria are consuming all of the oxygen. And when that happens, this floc, instead of forming a nice, tight sort of particulate mass, forms these loose conglomerates that don't settle out. That's a problem. So what happens here is the water enters the activated sludge tank, okay? That's where the oxygen comes in. And the water sits here in the settling zone, and then the floc settles out on the bottom in what's called the sludge zone. And that's what the flocculation process is good for, okay? The suspended material here conglomerates into the flocs that are deposited onto the bottom of the tank. And then in these secondary clarifiers, right, this is where the sludge, the floc, will settle out onto the bottom. And then there's scrapers that are located on the bottom of these tanks that will move that into the anaerobic sludge digester, okay, which I talked about before, and we're going to talk more about what that is at the end of the presentation. So here's a summary of what this process looks like, okay? This is the raw water. It's the primary effluent that comes into the aeration tank, okay, the activated sludge tank, where it's oxygenated. It moves to a clarifier settler, and that sludge then settles out on the bottom, and it's moved to the anaerobic digester. There's another option here, which is that instead of just discarding that material, is that it can actually get recycled, and it can be used to inoculate the next batch of primary effluent that's about to enter the secondary treatment process. And the more microbially diverse these flocs are, the more unique different types of metabolism are represented in the activated sludge tank, and the more unwanted chemicals and different types of microorganisms and organic nutrients that can be filtered out of the water. So in either secondary treatment method, whether we're talking about trickling filter or activated sludge, the key is the formation of either a biofilm or a floc, okay, that consists of an extra polysaccharide matrix. That's what we see here. So this is an example of how biofilms form. This exopolysaccharide matrix is what is formed by the digesting microbes, and it forms sort of like a filter. That's what the biofilm essentially functions as, or the floc functions as, is a filter that will trap different types of pathogens, and it will help the microbial filter continue to grow as they assimilate the nutrients that are within the water that's actually being filtered. So the takeaway message for this portion of the treatment process, and this is really the most important part, I think, of the water treatment process, is that the indigenous microbes, that's just those microbes that are naturally found in nature or in water, are cultivated, and they're cultivated to purify the wastewater by breaking down the organic particulate matter, the inorganic compounds that are then assimilated. They're either assimilated into the biofilm or assimilated into the flocs. And as that happens, the amount of available carbon that's present in the water, remember that the first goal of water treatment was to remove the amount of organic carbon in the water. As that organic material continues to be assimilated into these biofilms or into these flocs, the population of microbes decreases. This is maybe a good time to talk about biochemical oxygen demand, but I think before that, we're going to look at a couple water treatment plants here. So I went on Google Maps, and this is the water treatment plant in my hometown. So now that we've seen what the primary and the secondary treatment processes look like, we can begin to understand what we're seeing here. So these big, they look like, I don't know, big domes here, are the primary clarifiers. Now they don't look like the ones we saw before because they have these plastic covers on them. And I remember when I was a kid, they didn't have these. They were just open to the air. But there's houses just right over here, and people complained about the smell. So this was part of the solution, I guess, was to close these off to the air. And then from here, the water moves into the activated sludge tanks. Okay, so you can see the sludge is in here, and it's got that kind of bubbly, foamy appearance because there's oxygen that's being pumped into these tanks. And then the sludge that's collected either in the primary sludge that's collected from the clarifiers, or the sludge that's collected here and isn't used to just re-inoculate, is carried over to the anaerobic sludge digesters, which are located over here. And then this is the plant that we looked at the beginning. So I went across Lake Michigan and I found this plant in Milwaukee. And obviously this is a much bigger facility, so we see a lot of different primary clarifiers here. And then we have a lot of different activated sludge aerobic tanks that are located over here. So once again, this is the primary treatment portion of the plant. This is where secondary treatment's occurring. And then I think these are probably the secondary clarifiers, which is where the water in here, that after the secondary treatment is allowed, the floc is allowed to settle out, okay, and accumulate. So let's start reviewing now that we talked about the three different goals of wastewater treatment. And the first goal is to reduce the amount of total organic carbon excuse me, in the water. So I talked about this thing called biochemical oxygen demand, BOD, okay? And this is the concentration of oxygen that aerobic microorganisms need to decompose all of the organic matter that's in the water. So it's essentially a confusing way of measuring the amount of total organic carbon in the water, okay? But it's measured via the amount of oxygen that would be needed to decompose that organic matter. So raw sewage contains a lot of organic material. A lot of oxygen would be required to metabolize that organic material, so it has a high BOD. And the BOD should decrease as water moves through the treatment process. So, I mean, why do we really care about reducing the amount of total organic carbon in water treatment? It's because most microbes rely on carbon. I mean, really all microbes are going to rely on carbon for a lot of their anabolic pathways to be alive. So a high concentration of dissolved carbon corresponds to a favorable environment for microbe proliferation. So BOD in this sense can be used as sort of a gauge that measures how effective a process is at removing the amount of dissolved organic matter and hence removing microbes from the water. So a high BOD would imply that there's a lot of oxygen that's required to degrade or metabolize more carbon compounds in the water, which implies a better environment for microbe proliferation. So basically, a large amount of organic carbon corresponds to a large population of microbes, and we want to reduce that. We talked at the beginning why we want to get rid of pathogenic microorganisms from our water. Over 90% actually of the bacteria or the viruses or the parasites that are present in water will get trapped during flocculation, and they can be removed then from the clarified effluent. But pathogens in particular, they're on the losing end of a numbers game. So they're outcompeted usually for limited resources. They get eaten by other types of microbes. And even if that isn't enough, the clarified effluent or the secondary effluent gets disinfected before it's released from the plant, and we'll talk about how that's done in a little bit. So the third goal then is how do we reduce the concentration of inorganic compounds? Like I said, fertilizers that contain nitrates or phosphate-based fertilizers. And the reason this is important is because if we leave a lot of these compounds in the water and then we dump it into a natural body of water, the water is going to start to look like this. And this process is called eutrophication. So the problem is we have nitrogen and phosphate, things that are typically limiting nutrients, that are now present in excess, and that's leading to proliferation of algae in this case, which is what turns this water green. And the algae will consume a lot of oxygen, and that leads to an anoxic environment, which will kill the fish and the other, freshwater organisms that are living here. So we didn't really explicitly cover how inorganic compounds are reduced, but essentially it's a process of what's called simultaneous nitrification, denitrification. So during the secondary treatment process, the activated sludge treatment, what most plants will do is they'll use multiple tanks, that contain decreasing levels of oxygen. So each tank will then end up containing a different type of bacteria depending on the oxygen preference of the bacteria. So the preliminary tanks are oxic. They contain a large amount of oxygen, and the purpose of that is to oxidize, or to nitrify nitrogenous compounds like ammonia. And then we have progressively less oxic tanks or oxygen-deprived tanks, which create a reducing environment. So we have our ammonia oxidized to nitrate. The nitrate gets denitrified, as it moves through these progressively more anoxic tanks, reduced to nitrite, then nitric oxide, nitrous oxide, and then finally dinitrogen gas, which will diffuse out of the solution as a gas. So that's how we would remove nitrogen. Other strategies that plants use, altering the pH, adding different types of salts. This would specifically work well for phosphates. I'm thinking like a precipitation type reaction. So if I dump a bunch of calcium into water that contains phosphate, that phosphate will precipitate out as calcium phosphate. So now the clarified effluent has to be disinfected. So I mentioned before pathogens. Traditionally, disinfecting water is done using by chlorinating the water, and this is still the most popular method. So for this, we use bleach or hypochlorous acid. The basic principle is that adding this to water will oxidize pretty much any of the remaining organic matter, which will kill most of the bacteria or the other microbes that might be remaining even after secondary treatment. Problem with this method is the oxidized byproducts of chlorination aren't usually great chemicals or great things to have in appreciable quantities in water. So there's some concern over the safety as to how much of this kind of stuff we actually want in our water. A better option, although it's also more expensive, would be to use ozone. So here we have our friend ozone. And this is also safer to store because you can just store it as oxygen, and then it can be converted to ozone by applying a high voltage current. And the ozone will then break down. It forms oxygen-based radicals that will function as antimicrobials, similar to the way that obligate anaerobes are killed by aerobic environments by exposure to oxygen. And then a third option is to use UV light, which is strong enough to denature macromolecules to kill microbes, and it also can generate reactive oxidative species. So here we're seeing, this is kind of a cool application of how to use UV light to purify water. So this is some, Pacific island country or something, where they're purifying this bottled water by just letting it sit out in the sun, and the UV light will naturally kill a lot of the microbes that are present in this water. But the UV light that's used in wastewater treatment is produced by UV bulbs, right? So this is in some sort of a lab, but it's the same idea. The UV light in here is going to kill any of the microbes that are present inside the laminar flow hood. And this is the best picture I could find of what the apparatus actually looks like that's used in a wastewater treatment plant. So these bulbs produce ultraviolet light, and the water is passed through these. That kills any microbes that are remaining in the water. So I was talking before about this anaerobic sludge digester, and So we've got two sources of sludge. One is from the primary clarifiers, the big circular tanks, right, where the sludge settles out on the bottom and is collected. And then we also have the flock or sludge that's collected during the secondary treatment process that isn't being recycled. So in both cases, this activated sludge is carried to the anaerobic sludge digester. So what an anaerobic sludge digester is a anaerobic bioreactor, and that sludge is usually held in these tanks for about a month. So here we've got some nice anaerobic sludge digesters. How'd you like to have this in your backyard? Yeah. I'm not exactly sure where this is. This is not what they usually look like. I think they're usually a lot smaller. But a lot of times these vessels are heated or they're buried partially underground to help maintain a higher temperature. And the reason that's useful is because first of all, it increases the rate of degradation of organic material that's in the sludge, and it also can kill pathogens if the temperature is high enough. So the diversity of microbial anaerobic metabolisms that are usually exploited in these sludge digesters also means that you're going to get a large quantity of gases and other types of metabolic byproducts building up inside of the bioreactor that you have to deal with. And in many cases, the gas byproducts of anaerobic metabolism or fermentation can be chemically useful materials, okay, like we see here. And this is where biogas comes from. So biogas is a combination of primarily carbon dioxide and methane with traces of, I don't know, maybe some sulfur-based compounds too. And this biogas can be collected. Okay, so here's the anaerobic sludge digester tank here, and we have some sort of a mechanism designed to collect the biogas here. And some larger plants, will actually collect this, right, and they can sell the biogas as a sustainable energy source. Or, better yet, they might actually have power plants on site where the biogas is burned, and you can generate enough electricity doing that so that the entire water treatment facility can just be powered by burning the biogas that is naturally produced by the water treatment process. So one question we might have is why an anaerobic sludge digester, if I said aerobic metabolism is faster. And there's a couple reasons. One is that wouldn't produce the methane, or at least wouldn't produce as much of the methane or other potentially useful gases that we get out of anaerobic digestion. Also, it's just more expensive because then you have to have an enclosed tank, you have to be continuously pumping oxygen into it, and anaerobic metabolism is typically going to leave you with less residual undigested biomass or solid waste, which is important because the plant has to dispose of that. So what we're left with at the end of the day from the anaerobic sludge digester is this anaerobic digestate. And a lot of times this digestate will still have a pretty sizable pathogen population, or it'll have toxic concentrations of like some heavy metals. And can be a complicated situation, right? Because it requires special disposal then. In general, though, this kind of digestate it can be composted in some circumstances. It gets maybe sent to a landfill. That's probably the easiest option. Sometimes they'll incinerate it. But the best option, I think, is that a lot of times if the pathogen concentration is sufficiently low enough, or if it can be treated to reduce its toxicity and its biohazard level, this anaerobic digestate can be used in the production of fertilizers. So once again, it's a very sustainable method of fertilizer production, is to use the compounds that are naturally present in the environment, or at least are collected during the water treatment process, to create new fertilizers, okay, that can be essentially recycled. And that's pretty much it. So, I mean, water treatment in many ways, it's a complicated process, but the fundamental principles are fairly simple. Here's a nice summary figure. To review it, we've talked about the wastewater comes in, coarse debris are collected here. We have our bar screen or our mesh screen. I mentioned some plants will have sand and grit removal tanks to try to remove some of these kind of dangerous materials that could damage the plant equipment. And then we're at the primary clarification stage, where the solid sludge is collected. Okay, that gets sent to the sludge digester. We also have the secondary treatment phase. Okay, so this is using the activated sludge method, where we have aerobic metabolism occurring in the activated sludge tanks. Okay, secondary clarification, where the sludge accumulates. and that can either be collected and sent to the sludge digester, or it can be recycled to re-inoculate the incoming primary effluent into the activated sludge aeration tanks. And then we have the disinfection stage. So in this case, they're using chlorination, although you might use ultraviolet light, or they might use ozone. Really, the only thing we didn't talk about was this tertiary treatment step. And this is a step that's sometimes used for water purification, for reintroducing water into very sensitive ecosystems or environments. And that can be especially important, too, for discharging effluent into bodies of water from which drinking water is obtained. And although the focus of this presentation was on wastewater treatment, I want to talk a little bit about how drinking water is treated. The drinking water treatment process is, in principle, very similar to wastewater treatment. So the water is collected from natural sources and is usually purified using alum, which is a chemical flocculant that will aggregate sediment that's contained within the water, and then the water is usually disinfected with UV light or ozone in pretty much the same way that we discussed before, and then depending on where you live, that water is usually fluorinated. I don't think anyone anywhere in the world is sewage or wastewater directly converted into drinking water in the same facility, except I think Singapore has a plant that does that, I was reading about. But the methods of tertiary treatment will vary pretty extensively, and this is where some of the higher tech kind of methods come in. So it's maybe not very surprising then that some of these tertiary wastewater treatment methods are the exact same types of methods that are used in the drinking water industry. And many water treatment plants that use some of these sophisticated methods produce an effluent that is actually, in terms of the level of microbes and other contaminants, fairly similar to the quality that we would expect from drinking water. And in fact, a lot of times the drinking water treatment process has less to do with removing dangerous microbes than it does with improving the aesthetic qualities of the water, the smell and the taste. This is, I think, a drinking water facility where they're using reverse osmosis to purify the water. And, the types of processes that are used here could be another whole, probably 45-minute long video in and of themselves. But I hope you've gotten at least a sense of how wastewater treatment is a process that depends very much on microbes, Microbiology is at the center of wastewater treatment. And even though it is complicated in terms of the actual process involved, the underlying things that are happening are relatively simple and I think readily intelligible and important for people to recognize so that they know what actually happens to their wastewater, and it's not just this sort of magical process where you pour something down the drain and it disappears forever.